You're listening to the Procuretech podcast, your weekly show for all that's cooking in the digital procurement space. Yes, we've got the hottest startups, thought leadership, and conversation from visionary industry experts, and definitely no stiff corporate content. I'm your host, James Meads, procurement pro, digital nomad, and Procuretech fanboy. And now, here's this week's show. And we're live. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to another edition of the Procuretech Pub. And we call it the pub because it's really just an informal chat about what's going on in a particular corner of the procurement tech space. We're definitely not drinking beer at this time of day. I've got my water next to me. And my guest is coming from Canada, where it's still quite, well, not early in the morning, but it's still morning. So there will definitely not be any alcohol consumed during this pub session. So my guest today is Joël Collin-Demers from Montreal. Joël, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Joël, just give a quick introduction. Your background is in the source to pay space. Maybe just give us a quick minute or two introduction of how you got into this and some of your background. And then we'll get into the meat on the bone of today's discussion, which is really talking about the dynamic of the source to pay application market, how to craft a transformation roadmap if you're in that space, some of the developments in terms of maturity, difference between best of breed and some of the suites, and where we think the market is headed. So, yeah, before we do that, tell us all about yourself.
Yeah, sure.
Something exciting. What's your favorite vegetable and why, or something like that?
Eggplant with some salt. No, yeah. So I mean, I've been in the procurement tech space, as you said, for about 12 years now. So I started off with my bachelor in business with specialization in IT management, and then straight out of school, I went to IBM and did an internship before that as well in a business process management firm. But anyways, ended up at IBM in the SAP practice and fell into the procurement modules for implementation. I thought it would be interesting to tell other people how to spend their money instead of spending mine, so that I'd get home and be tired of talking about spending all day. And so, I'd end up saving. That was the logic behind it. And then, ended up progressing from there, implementing for direct materials, for indirect materials, looking at Ariba and different other source to pay applications that sit on top of ERP. And for 3 years now, I've been in my own independent consultancy called Pure Procurement, and essentially doing the type of work we'd be discussing today, right? So helping clients navigate what is an increasingly diverse space of applications and helping them think about that, because it's like the old pasta story, right? Like there used to be 3 pasta sauces at the grocery store, and it'd be very easy to make a decision and be satisfied with your decision. And now you go to the grocery store and there are hundreds of pasta sauces. And if you're going to analyze them all, it's going to take you a whole bunch of time. And you scientifically, you're going to be less satisfied with your decision than if you had less choices, right? So I think it's trying to approach it where you're going to look at absolutely everything and make the best possible decision is not a viable strategy these days. So yeah, anyways, I've been doing that for 12 years, and it's still interesting, so I'm still here.
So 12 years, so that would have been 2010. So I'm guessing that would have been round about the time that Ariba, Coupa, Jagger, all of these big suites, iValua, Basware, Zycus, these were all sort of coming onto the market, or starting to mature as applications that were really sort of all in one suite. And that was really on vogue at the time, I suspect. So is that a good place to start in terms of the context? Was that pretty much, have I got that pretty much right in terms of that time period?
Yeah, I think so. Like in 2012 is when SAP purchased Ariba, and then for a little while there, they didn't do much with it. They were 2 separate organizations, and I think it was just it was a matter of determining how they were going to look at integration over time. So that took a bit of time, but I would say it was very early in that period, and adoption in the market really started more around 15, 16, 17, at least from the Canadian market perspective. So, I think that was a good period, right? Where we were realizing that the base ERP that you had put in place, there were other modules that you could get to help you do the sourcing piece and the user experience piece to build on top of your ERP, but the tools were still very, very rudimentary. So all those big firms either built out capabilities themselves or went and acquired capabilities to be able to offer the full suite. And when I say the full suite, I mean the full value chain of procurement, right? So being able to help you with category management and spend analysis, sourcing processes, contract management processes, and then what your traditional ERP does, which is more, purchasing and procure to pay, and then even going into accounts payable and then supplier relationship management, right? So if you've got all of those pieces and able to offer them, then I'd consider you're a full suite.
Yeah, and we'll come on to that a little bit later around to what extent can some of these source to pay applications cover, some of the more niche requirements that pretty much every procurement organization is going to have, things like contract management, SRM, increasingly now ESG, which is kind of SRM in terms of know your supplier, or KYS as it's starting to be called, with a nod to the banks, they call KYC know your customer. Yeah, I want to go back to the comment that you made around the pasta sauce. I think I didn't plan to go down this route, but I will just before we sort of tackle the sort of the state of the market. You mentioned, the pasta sauce and having choice and it was easy back then when there were only 3 pasta sauces. I actually make my own pasta sauce. And I enjoy cooking. I actually make my own pasta sauce. So that sort of led me on to a sort of question to say, is there any sense or is there any justification for a company to say we'll build our own S2P tool? And I'll put that into context that obviously if you're ex at IBM and you've been working mainly with Ariba and Cooper and those type of applications, your clients would have been very much sort of large enterprise clients. So, clearly if you're a mid-market business, you're not going to develop in-house your own S2P suite. But what are the pros and cons of doing it for enterprise? Because you often see it, don't you? And when you look at things like DPW, Scout Lab, when you've got these big corporations looking at, potentially building something from scratch or scouring the market to see if there's a company that can help them build it. What are the pros and cons of that approach?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. When you said you were making pasta sauce, I went in another direction where I was going like, well, you need to make your own pasta sauce in the sense that you shouldn't buy something off the shelf for everything, right? You're going to have a different context. You're going to want to pick and choose, and you may have to build out integrations or specific functionalities. But to answer your question more directly, I've never seen it in 12 years of practice, somebody building out their own application, right? What I've seen is people building out their own little bits of functionality that may be missing from a core suite or from a core tool, right? So I think you need to approach it that way, where it's really a pyramid, right? You have your ERP, which is the base, and it's connected to all your other functions, and then you go and get applications to help you do some things that your ERP doesn't do, extend functionality, and then you may go and get specific applications for a specific vertical or a very specific vertical within a vertical, right? And if you can't find something that's cost effective that's going to help you do that, then that's where you want to build little functionalities, little apps that are going to connect into your other applications and allow you to do things that are specific to your business, your context, your industry, that may not be available on the market.
But is that still a viable strategy now? Especially if I look at Ariba and Cooper that have their app stores, if you've got other best of breed applications now that can relatively simply be connected to it, has that sort of diminished the justification for building an in-house app that does, a little bit on the side that a suite can't do out of the box? Absolutely.
And I think over time, what you're going to see is like a gradual funneling down of the use cases where it's an appropriate strategy, because if it's a viable strategy for you, or if it's functionality that you need, then somebody else in the world, in your space, in your industry needs it, right? But I think there are still a little category of niche use cases where that's still a viable strategy. And the proof to me is that we're still seeing the multiplication of all these offerings on the market where there are gaps, right? So there are still gaps. There's still areas to generate value in. And sometimes you'll be ahead of the software market in identifying those within your business.
Are you seeing a move away from, I mean, there's this platform approach that Dr. Eloise Epstein talks about and has written about a lot. And I do wholeheartedly agree that there has to be some sort of single source of truth. But does it necessarily now need to be a source to pay or a procure to pay suite? Or are you seeing now that companies are starting to use something like a Tealbook or a Hicks or even maybe something like a Zip as somewhere to store supplier data and evaluations and contracts and all of the sort of data around managing vendors, and then P2P can be a separate best of breed tool that sort of fits into that?
Yeah, I've started to see that. I think it's different based on the piece of data that you're talking about. So the vendor master is the big one and the right one. So you need to be conscious of how you're going to build that in. But there's always associated costs as well, and it depends on what's the maturity of your procurement department. What is the maturity of the rest of your organization in their comprehension of what procurement is and how far it can generate value? What's how much spend do you have in your organization as well? Because all of these applications have a cost, right? And that piles up on top of each other, right? So there's that aspect to it as well. But yeah, the single source of truth concept is definitely needs to be thought of as you're crafting your roadmap, crafting your strategy. And then, you'll have to adapt it. I think if like Dr. Louise Epstein's vision is correct, if you do not have any money constraints, right? Any budgetary constraints, and you want to go with all these best of breed applications. But if you do have those types of constraints, then you have to make choices, might make trade-offs and decisions on what you're going to prioritize. Data definitely needs to be at the top of that list. It's just depending on, if you only have, I don't know, a couple thousand vendors versus 20, 30, 60,000 vendors, then your priorities are going to be a bit different, right? In terms of master data management, you might choose to support an ERP vendor master data process with, a smaller MDM suite or an MDM suite that's not specific to procurement, but, that's applicable for all the master data management across your business. So there's always going to be tugging between
things like parts and finished products and that type of thing, you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Or customers, bill of materials, like all the master data that you could have within a business, right? So you're always going to have that tug and pull between those purist applications or IT driven applications where it's like, well, we have master data within all of the different business functions. Why can't we do that in a central application versus the function specific applications where, for example, HICX or Tealbook, where procurement's going to say, no, we want a built for purpose application for vendor data and procurement data. So it's an ongoing conversation and trade-off to evaluate within the business, because as I say, it comes back to the overall cost as well, and how you're going to be able to justify that business case, and also what horizon your business forces on you to justify a business case, right? Like justifying on 3 years versus 5 years versus 10 years is going to give you a lot more, a lot of different possibilities if you're a longer time horizon.
So, I mean, We've obviously come a long way since when you first started out in this game, 12 years ago, where there were, I guess, probably 5 potential candidates to go out and buy, if you're looking at source to pay technology, and all of them was all in one suites back then. What are you seeing now in terms, if we look at, if someone came to you today and wanted some advice on, what should they go down, what should they do, or what should they consider in terms of sourcing and procuring and installing what they want to do? Obviously, now the first question, I suspect, is going to be, do they go down the suite route, or do they go down the best of breed route and then do something else around data management? Guide us through what typically that looks like in terms of the process of how they would go about doing that, or how you would advise them to do that.
Yeah. So I think there's 2 aspects to this. One is how you approach the market. The other is how do you how do you ensure you know your business, you know your spend profile, right? Because depending on your spend profile and the context of your organization, my answer is going to be different. So like, for example, if you're 100% indirect, you don't have material masters, BOMs, you don't do any production per se, my answer is going to be different than if you're, in manufacturing, you have MRO purchasing, you have, a lot of direct parts as well for manufacturing, for production. So I think there's a couple things, right? One of them is you want to make sure that you have a good comprehension of the as is or the current state of your organization's processes and org structure and existing technologies as well, even if those are Excel sheets and, access databases and whatnot. So making sure you go around the different functional teams in your business and get at least a Pareto 80-20% view of what's actually going on, how people are buying, especially if you're in a decentralized model today and are looking to use your procurement transformation and the digitalization of your procurement processes as a way to put central procurement in place as well, strategic procurement. So I think the central versus decentralized model is to take into consideration as well. So you do your roadshow through the different functional units and potentially geographies, potentially as well, different teams that you may have. And then you want to make sure you're addressing that in terms of the spend priority as well, right? So 80-20, you could base it on that, right? If you have like 20 business units, but they don't spend anything, well, don't necessarily go around and talk to each one of them. They can get into your final solution fairly easily, right? You want to make sure you address those big pieces. From there, you would craft your vision on an end state, right? Like, what are the pieces? And it kind of relates back to what we were saying at the beginning around, okay, well, what are we going to do for spend analysis, for sourcing, for contract management, procure to pay, and supplier relationship management? And given the context of the as is and the constraints it may bring about or not, right? And then from there, you want to share that vision. So go back to your different stakeholders, share that vision, get feedback on it, right? And this is all agnostic of technology, right? It's more for those modular pieces, which is typically mirrors what's on the market in terms of offerings. Where are you positioning yourself, right? What's really important? What do you think you're going to need, above and beyond functionality in that space to be able to get all the value out of your procurement processes? And I could give you an example for that, right? So contract management, everybody and their mother seems to have a contract management tool that allows you to do workflow. But obligation management is something that's very niche and more specific, where you want to follow SLAs on contracts. Right. So like there's levels of functionality within those contract management modules and tools. And if you know that you have a very specific way of dealing with contracts, well, you know that's probably going to be a focus area for you.
Yeah, and likewise as well. I mean, a lot of the more upstream parts of CLM, I'm thinking around the sort of negotiation and authorization and sign-off stage that tends to sort of typically fall more into the legal tech space. If you look at the startups that are out there doing that, none of these suites are able to do that. None of them have sort of DocuSign or Adobe Sign capability for sign-off. None of them have got any clause databases or use any AI or any sort of smart technology to do redlining or to import and export from a master Microsoft Word document. So if that's something that's a must-have, I don't think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Joël, the market, in the enterprise suite space a lot better than I do, but I don't think there's anyone out there that does that as a module. Yeah,
there's a lot of integrations with those types of tools. So like DocuSign to get, say you have an Ariba or an iValue or Coupa, they're just going to plug into the best of breed DocuSign tool or Adobe Sign tool and allow you to integrate with that. And I think, they're moving towards embedding AI and embedding smart contracting in there. But to your point, I don't think it's there 100% yet, right? And there's there's the legal department, which they're going to have their own needs for other types of contracts, sales contracts, partnership contracts. How are you approaching that from a contract management strategy, right? Is it always internal template based? Are you using external templates for your contracts? So those are all types of things that you want to be aware of and know that you're going to need ideally from a CLM solution before you craft a go-to-market strategy, right? So
So best case then with a source to pay suite, best case is that you're going to get a repository function that will send out reminders and that you can do tags and that you can incorporate your stakeholders to have, or your suppliers to have visibility and add and amend documents if you want them to. You're also going to have the functionality that it can integrate with some of the popular applications on the market for authorization and signature, but you're not going to, unless you go out and buy a best of breed piece of software specifically to bolt onto it, it's not going to do sort of advanced CLM. I think So
the only thing I'd add to what you were saying is you'll have natively like a clause library and contract templates as well. So you'll be able to, get your legal to put in pre-approved clauses, pre-approved alternative clauses, for example. And so as procurement, you're running your negotiation with the supplier and they fight you on a clause or they ask you to change a clause. You can use an alternative clause. And if you stay within what's been configured by your legal department as pre-approved clauses, then you don't need to bring legal into the process, right? So that is usually standard as well. And then, as I say, as we progress over time as well, and they see what competitors are doing that are more pure play solutions for CLM, well, they start embedding those functionalities in the tools as well, right? So, but that's always the trade-off, right? Is if you have that end-to-end solution, they're going to innovate quickly, but they're going to innovate quickly over the whole platform, right? They're not necessarily going to innovate as fast as someone who's focusing just on contract management.
Right. And that's understandable, isn't it? Because that one's trying to be a jack of all trades and the other one's trying to be a single sort of world-class solution. Hey, so just a quick interlude to let you know about procurementsoftware.site. This is a new website that I recently launched to give you, the listener, a free-to-access, intuitive guide to digital procurement technology. You can filter on a multitude of different criteria and pick out a short list of procurement software solutions that are relevant to your business and your needs in less time than it takes to boil an egg. No corporate subscriptions, no complex jargon, and definitely no pay-to-play model. We are a completely transparent, open book, and we really want to get your feedback on what we can really do to make this user experience better and constantly improve so as we're providing value to you. Check out procurementsoftware.site. And now let's get right back to this week's podcast. Let's talk a little bit about sourcing, because certainly, SAP Ariba started off essentially as being an e-auction tool and then sort of morphed into being an S2P. Some of the others sort of typically sort of grew from the other side, being mainly sort of procure to pay, and then incorporated sourcing capability at a later date. In terms of the state of the market now, with the modules that are integrated sort of out of the box with the big source to pay suites, are they more focused on strategic sourcing / complex tenders, or is it more around sort of tail spend management or bringing sort of operational sourcing into one single source of truth and out of people's inboxes and Excel sheets? Which one do you think it's more skewed towards, or maybe it differs depending on the solution?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, right? It depends on the solution, right? Which is why it's so important to know what your need is, right? And are we a manufacturing shop that we need to put three quotes out ideally for every SKU, and we already know the manufacturer part number, we know the quantity, we know exactly what our requirement is. So it's simple sourcing, and we want to automate that as much as possible and generate value by going out to market, as much as possible on each part. Or are we more on the complex procurement side where you're using a 7-step AT Kearney strategic sourcing process and you're looking for more functionality around collaboration with the supplier, either on manufactured parts, or on more IT-based application sourcing, for example, right? That type of thing. So where I see the market is like everybody's kind of picking their own vertical, right? Around that, and potentially even category specific solutions where sourcing marketing agencies is very different than sourcing brokers for real estate transactions, or so knowing your profile and then knowing what you're going to try to do as a sourcing operation before you go out to look at the
marketing's a big one. The other one that's logistics and transportation is another one. That whatever e-sourcing tool you use, whether you use Cooper and Ariba's sourcing module, or if you take a best of breed e-sourcing tool, it's extremely hard to do. Print and promotional items, as I'm sure a sort of nod to my friend Sarah Scudder, who talked about that a lot and was one of my former podcast guests, and also logistics and transportation. Also, Peter Kynes was actually my first guest, the CEO of Freight Tender. They're a logistics sourcing tool, and that is very niche as well. There are certain tech categories, no matter what e-sourcing tool you use, unless it's category specific, you're probably going to get garbage from your auction or from your sourcing event.
Or you're going to have to supplement that with a lot of manual activity, which you were trying to get rid of with the implementation of the original tool, right? Which is why, like, to come back and wrap off where I was saying, like, you go get your as is, you craft a solution agnostic to be, right? Like your ideal end state. And then from there, generate buy-in from the different functions, right? If we can get us to here, does that make sense for you guys? Does that generate value for you guys? Yes. How so? And understand the value or the dynamics of value generation within your business for procurement as well. And then that's when you have that perspective that you're able to look at, okay, how are we going to approach the market, right? Do we know that, sourcing processes, we're always going to use internal templates for contracting, or it's always going to be external? And then that's going to influence what type of functionality I'm looking for CLM, right? And are there one or two verticals where we know that we're going to have very specific deep needs for deep functionality, and others we can live with something that's more out of the box, right? Where it's more standard functionality, I would say. So gaining that perspective is extremely valuable. And then when you look at going to the market, well, yes, you can look at the Gartners, the Forresters of this world. I feel like there's the scope that they're looking at is fairly small in terms of what you're looking at. But I'd look more at going to something like Digital Procurement World, looking at the Spend Matters documentation, looking at your site, procurementsoftware.site, where you see the whole directory of what's available, and just getting a sense for, does anybody hit those keywords that we know we're looking for, right? And you might have to learn the jargon as well, like obligation management for CLM, for example, is not necessarily how you would term it within the business. So getting that education period as well, right? And then as you do that, your perspective might change a little bit. You might want to go see somebody in each of the verticals, right? Guided buying, sourcing, contract management, P2P, AP automation, SRM, just to get a sense for, okay, well, what are the best of breed applications doing in that space, so that I can objectively measure my P2P suites or S2P suites afterwards, right? So I think it's a matter of getting that education before you actually go out and do it, right? So it's a lot more involved than just running an RFP, right? If you want to get that to get it right, but it doesn't mean you need to go see every single application, right? You'll get a sense fairly quickly for, okay, what can we do? What can we not do? What's the art of the possible?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Bit more detailed answer than I was expecting, but it's really, it's really, really good to be able to be able to showcase that, because I do think knowledge of the market, or at least enough to be dangerous and ask the right questions of the suite providers when they claim to be everything to everybody, it is necessary. And, what their suites can do may be sufficient for what you need it to do, but it may not. And to know the difference and to know the capabilities of the best of breed tech that's out there, I think is key in terms of understanding the cost versus value for money proposition from some of the big suite providers. Less so maybe if you're a big enterprise organization, but maybe if you're on the cusp of being able to realize an ROI on a suite investment, if you're maybe a $1-2 billion or euro company, that's sort of on the cusp, isn't it? Where it may be more provident to go best of breed and just make the applications speak to one another. Sorry, no, go ahead.
Hook on that point that you said around having the applications talk to one another, right? That's an extremely important piece that, as procurement professionals, we may not, be alerted to. Is what are their integration methods for the tool with other tools, right? Do they have open APIs? Are they sending flat files? Like what's the degree of integration with other tools? And then the other piece is that's technical integration, but then functional integration as well, right? Can I change all of the labels in the tool so that I don't have different verbiage across my applications, right? So that I have a division here, a department there, a plant here, and they all mean the same thing from a data standpoint, but when you're a business user using the tool, it's very confusing, right? So being able to align language across your tools is an important consideration as well.
Yeah, and also how many people will need access to the various tools? Because if you're going for a best of breed spend analytics platform, then not really a big deal because only procurement and finance are going to use it. But if you're looking at P2P or vendor master data management or contracts, then that's a whole different ballgame. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about supplier relationship management, because that's the other one. SRM is the other big one where there are a huge amount of best of breed tools and something that the source to pay suites can do to a certain extent. But the route that we're going down now, particularly around more visibility and traceability of the supply chain, ESG scores, certification, especially if you're in highly regulated industries like automotive or food and beverage production, where you need a lot of quality or health and safety certification. To what extent would you recommend an automotive supplier or food and beverage supplier, for example, to buy one of these legacy suites, or do you think they will need a best of breed tool to manage all of their SRM needs?
I think they're eventually going to get to the realization that they need a best of breed tool to run SRM, but it's always like a prioritization at the time. What's the biggest thing that hurts? The issue or the consideration with supplier data is it's the base piece of data on which you build everything else, right? Your transactions, your orders, your sourcing events, etc. So having a good supplier data model from the beginning is key to success and to not painting yourself into a corner later on, right? So if you're going to spend additional time on one of the verticals, SRM is the one to do that with, because as I say, it's going to have ramifications on everything else, right? Because your Oracle or JD Edwards or SAP backend has one supplier structure. Your S2P tool has another supplier structure, right? Because you're going to have your sourcing suppliers, which you need minimal information on because you may not ever do business with them. Then as you get them through contracting, you're going to have to get more information to be able to sign a contract, and then more information to be able to transact with them, right? Direct deposit information, bank accounts, tax information, other payment information. So, and legal entity management if it's a big organization as well. So all of those things are considerations that if you don't give some thought to them at the beginning, you implement the solution, you start using it, and then you run into these use cases where you have this massive contract structure with a supplier where you have a master agreement, but you also have multiple sub agreements, and they tie to different types of orders, and it just becomes a mess. And there's a lot of manual things that you're going to end up doing because you didn't take the time to give yourself the tools and the comprehension of what your supplier data needs to be able to do to support your business correctly over time.
Yeah, no, it's an honest answer, but I think you're right that particularly in these industries that need to do a lot of due diligence on their supply base or need to maintain a lot of certification, it's a necessary evil that they're probably going to have to go with a separate tool to manage all of that. Yeah,
and I find that just that piece though, like the like getting certifications, getting documentations, or what I'll call the qualification process, like making sure that depending on the category of suppliers and how they're going to be dealing with you, that impose your requirements on them, and you make sure they stay up to date over time as well. So like if the insurance certificate is good for 2 years, after 2 years, boom, automatic notification kicks out if you're still using that supplier for transactions. I think most tools are doing an adequate job, like the source to pay tools, doing an adequate job at that functionality. I think it's more where you're saying like, putting ESG requirements in there, acting as a hub for that supplier data so that I can centralize everything and then push it out to other applications. And I like Stephanie at Tealbook's analogy for this. She goes, It should be like contacts in your phone, right? You pick up a new phone, which is a new S2P application, a new best of breed application. And then you go on your contacts, you sign into your contact tool, and then everything's uploaded into your tool automatically, right? Like that's the dream for suppliers. But as you know, each application has their own fields for suppliers. They're all named a certain way. So you need to do a certain, mapping exercise. So having that data management piece of it, I think, and that's why I was focusing on that in the my first answer is that's where there's applications that will do it much better than others in the pure play space. And that's what you should be focusing on and thinking about is flexibility, right? Over time to be able to extend and reduce and change my master data, change my master data to fit my evolving application landscape in procurement.
Have you ever implemented at a client that manages P2P outside of their ERP system and just punches back into whatever system they're using to pay invoices?
Yes. Do you mean an SRM solution or just in general?
Yeah, just bypassing something like SAP or Oracle completely for the P2P process and having a standalone tool, be that a suite or be it a best of breed P2P application, and then just having that sort of punch back in or sort of transferring the data even manually through a CSV file if it's a fairly small business into their financial, into their payments application.
Yeah, no, I've done that, and the correct spend profile to do something like that is where your spend is 100% indirect, right? And what I mean by indirect, right, it's a very confusing term. Is if you don't have any material masters, bill of materials, inventory management, then you've got a profile where you can look at that type of setup where you do everything in the source to pay layer and you just send an okay to pay file at the end of the process to your accounting system for payment. Right. When you have any sort of inventory management, then you need to look at it a bit more closely because you're going to have a portion of your users that are going to have to live in ERP, right? They're going to have to manage MRP, manage your bill of materials, integrate with plant maintenance systems, manage inventory and goods receipts. So if you're going to do like a dual strategy where you do your indirect in one tool and your direct in the other, does it make sense to do that based on your user base, right? Or should you look at something where you keep your procure to pay in the ERP system, but you look at a visualization layer on top of it to make it easier, right? Like I'm thinking of Zip. They're a new player in the space, so I've never implemented them, but I see the potential there for doing something like that. I know, in the SAP side, they're looking at guided buying. They're getting that from an application development standpoint as well. So they're looking at guided buying in S4 in the Fiori tiles as being the layer for indirect management. And then if you need to go in the old SAP screens, you can. So I think, that's where it gets more complex, is where you have that dual profile or you have a lot of direct spend, and you want your users to have a good user experience when they are purchasing indirect. But if they're going to be purchasing direct anyways, maybe it's just a catalog punch out strategy from your ERP. So there's a lot of different things to think about in that scenario, which unfortunately I don't have the map, right? I don't have the checklist that allows us to do that with our eyes closed. But that's why I say it's still interesting, right? To get back to what I was saying at the outset of the podcast is depending on your context, it's always a bit different. The answers are always a bit different, but that's the type of work I do with folks, right? To have that discussion and try to give them those guiding principles in their context to make those decisions.
And every consultant always says it depends. It's normal, and it's perfectly legit because no company is the same. And while there are some things that do have a clear yes or no answer, do these large legacy suites have a good UX? Absolutely not. I mean, I think I would categorically say that, but can they still be the best choice under certain circumstances? Yeah. Well, absolutely. It really depends on the application and what you want to get out of it.
And it's the old Dunning-Kruger effect, right? I don't know if you've ever seen that graph. It's like if you spend a minimal amount of time on a new topic, you feel like you're an expert. Like you go, oh, I get it. And then you keep going. And you keep diving a bit deeper, and then you feel your level of competence going down and then slowly rising back up over time, right? So to be a true expert in a field, you need to be mindful that it's gonna take a while it's like wine, right? You start looking at a couple different types of wine and you go, okay, I get the wine, Italy, the South American countries, etc. Like I get the dynamic. And then you keep drinking wine for a while. And you go, oh no, I do not get the dynamic finally, right? And like I need to keep drinking wine a bit more to get it. So
yeah,
it's kind of the same thing.
Absolutely, and different people have different specialisms, right? I mean, you're an expert on the implementation side, particularly on the larger applications. I think I know the market holistically very, very well in terms of what's out there, the number of providers, what they all do. I wouldn't know the first thing about doing an actual on-site implementation because I've never done it. So yeah,
and it's just on that point, it brings something to mind, which is, and we also at all levels try to go a bit faster than we should in terms of our organization's capacity for change adoption. So I've seen that like over 12 years, that's been the common theme, right? It doesn't matter if it's a procurement application and a source to pay tool, just a sourcing suite or whatnot, but we often have the pressure of the budget and the timeline and wanting to do a lot, but we also have that tendency to overestimate what we're able to ingest as a change in the organization because everybody's doing their own day-to-day at the same time. So that'd be my biggest takeaway from the implementation piece is go slower than you think you should, and then come back, right? Plan for coming back and doing continuous improvement with the application that you just implemented, because that's where you're going to get the true value, right? Because you're going to come in, implement it once, people are going to start using it. They're going to need that 6 months to ramp up and really soak in how to use the application and the training that you've made available to them, either on premise or on demand, hopefully both. And then they're only going to have adopted 60 to 70% of what you taught them, right? But the big value, there's big value in getting that additional 30%. So coming back and not re-implementing, but optimizing and continuously improving the solution is where you're going to get a lot of value in it. And unfortunately, that's where I see a lot of organizations just kind of go on to the next thing, right? Instead of really wringing out the value that they paid for.
Yeah, and wringing out the value that you've paid for, especially in one of these suites, is key, isn't it? Because they're not cheap. No. What's the fastest end-to-end implementation time you've ever experienced for one of these? Because one of the criticisms is, well, not only are these suites usually quite expensive compared to best of breed, but typically they take a lot longer to implement and embed and sort of get out of hypercare, whereas the best of breeds tend to sell, and I do think this is a little bit of a cliche, but they tend to sell this, digitize in a day or digitize in a week. And, I also take that with a bit of a pinch of salt, and I think it's BS to some extent, but certainly within weeks, it's possible. Whereas, you hear stories of some of these big suites taking years in some cases. Well, what's your personal experience?
Yeah, well, even if you're going to buy a suite, you're going to have a modular approach, right? So versus buying a CLM, best of breed and implementing the module, the CLM module of a source to pay suite, I think you're going to have similar implementation times because you have similar data requirements. You have similar processes that you're going to implement, right? So I don't think it's an application specific piece. I think it comes back to overestimating our capacity to adopt change as an organization and the complexity that we have. But yeah, I mean, I've typically seen like the upstream modules like sourcing and contract management could be anywhere from 2 to 4 months is a realistic time frame if you're gonna roll out something with templates, but then there's a long process after that of optimizing, right? Of making sure that everybody's using it. You may have to, if you have multiple different procurement organizations throughout the world, then the 2 to 4 months is the initial pilot, the initial implementation of those templates. But then from a change management standpoint, you're going to need to plan a couple of weeks to go and implement it in each of the other procurement locations, right? Procurement centers within your organization. So I think there's that initial longer timeline to implement. P2P, I've seen longer, right? Like 6 to 9 months, I want to say.
That's always going to be the most complex, isn't it? Because of all the vendor data that you've got to integrate into it, whereas the others can almost be standalone modules, can't they? So and
it's always a question of integration, right? Integration is what's going to be the most complex and take you the most amount of time because it depends on what you're integrating to. Are there plugins? Do you have a middleware? Should you have a middleware if you don't have one? So all of these types of questions, and the integration is always where the most complex problems are, because you need to have someone who has the expertise or knows how to ask the right questions to do like end-to-end data flows, right? Like if I'm doing sourcing and then contract management, and then I want my contract to end up in my ERP system, for example, and then drive purchase orders from there and integrate that with a vendor network where I'm putting vendors into the portal and moving that along as well. Like that's going to be one of the most complex use cases, right? Whereas something where there's much less integration, there's less complexity, I can roll it out faster, and there's less of a hypercare period.
Awesome. Joël, last question, really easy one. If anyone would like to connect with you or get in touch, what's the best way?
Yeah, well, there's you could go on my website, pureprocurement.ca. I'm also fairly active on LinkedIn. As I was telling you before we started recording, I haven't been in 2022. I haven't been as active as I would want to be. I've been caught up on other things, on client projects, and a 1 and a 3-year-old. So that takes up a lot of time as well. But I'd say, yeah. And the last thing is, if you can reach out at joel@pureprocurement.ca just by email as well. If there's anything you want to discuss, I'd be happy to.
Awesome. And I will link to that in the notes. This will be published as a podcast this time next week for anyone that's watching or watching a recording of the live stream. For anyone that's on the podcast, we'll drop that in the show notes. So, Joël, thank you very much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you back on, and really appreciate your insights and knowledge on this topic. Keep in touch. Cheers. Yeah,
likewise. It's always a pleasure discussing with somebody who is a fellow procure-to-pay nerd, right? There's not that many of us out there, but there's tremendous value to be generated from conversations with.
Awesome.
Take care.
Cheers.